earlier. My mic, is it not working? Not working.
Press on the bottom.
Here comes our, sorry, I can always shout. Is it working?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm saying that we're going to start a little earlier today in the hopes of also ending somewhat earlier. I have today a stellar cast. I'm not going to say distinguished because that makes everyone sound old, and no one wants to be old nowadays. So our first speaker today will be Mark Lowenthal, who has had quite a career in government, including 3 years at the CIA. And our second speaker will be Paul Pillar, whom I assume everyone in this room is familiar with, since I assume that you're all reading the National Interest website, which I edit. And Paul is an indefatigable contributor. He has his own blog on national security issues. And our final speaker will be George Beebe, who has just been elevated to the position of Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for the National Interest. And I have to say, he has gotten off to a lightning fast start with this meeting itself, Exhibit A. I think he pulled it together within 3 or 4 days. That is perhaps an unheard of record in Center for the National Interest history. So our topic today is stormy relations between the White House and the intelligence community. And the intelligence community has been in a number of storms over the decades. One that I think of is the 1970s, when William Colby did when I met with Samuel Huntington years ago. He looked at me indignantly and he said, "He spilled the beans." So there is always a, I think, somewhat contentious relationship between White Houses, which have historically tried to prompt the CIA to undertake actions that they can then disclaim. And today, we may have a new set of factors between Trump and the intelligence community, because I think, to my knowledge, and it's always dangerous to say unprecedented, but to my knowledge, no president has frontally attacked the intelligence agencies, referring them to as a deep state that is potentially plotting against his presidency. So with that, I would like to begin with Mark.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you for inviting me. I was asked to talk about the context of the worldwide threat assessment that Dan Coates gave, which is how the latest contretemps between the president and the intelligence community began, how they actually handled priorities, intelligence priorities at a senior level, and talk a little bit about the role of Congress. It was one of my jobs at one point. I was the staff director of the House Intelligence Committee, so I've been on both sides of this argument. So the worldwide threat assessment, George Tenet began giving those reports when he was working for Bill Clinton, and George did this because he thought it was important to lay out for the Congress in public how he saw the world, what he thought the major issues were, his major concerns, and he thought it was especially important to do this during a time of declining budgets, because the intelligence budget began to go down after the end of the Cold War. The peace dividend, the non-existent peace dividend, came more harshly out of the intelligence budget proportionally than it did out of the defense budget, and Tenet felt it was important to show the disparity between threats and declining capabilities. And so he gave this on his own. He volunteered to do this, and it became a set piece. And so the DNI, now the DNI, then the DCI, whoever that is, does this every year. He does it for the 2 intelligence committees, the 2 armed services committees, the 2 foreign relations committees. Clapper told me, I think he did it 9 times one year, because they also do it in secret. We also saw the public one, and then there's a document, which if you have not actually read the document, and I'll come back to that, It's on the DNI website, and I really would urge you to read it. It's really quite good. And so Tenon was the one who established the threat assessment. And the threat assessment, again, is the DNI's view of the world. These are the things about which I am most concerned. And they are in a certain order. I read them every year, and in one of the courses we use in my company, we rack and stack to see how the order changes, which is kind of interesting. If they always say this is not in any rank order, yes it is. It is in a rank order. And cyber has been running with number 1 for several years. What's interesting is number 2 this year is influence operations and affecting elections. Now, I think that's a really interesting number 2 for Dan Coates to put in there. And so then they go through a bunch of global threats, topical threats, and then they go into regional threats. There's a change in the regional threats. They usually start with East Asia, Eurasia. The first regional threat is China and Russia. It's a separate category, and then they go into that together. There's also an interesting line in the forward in which Coates basically says that U.S. allies and friends are trying to adjust to a lack of confidence in the United States. Now, he doesn't say it in quite those words, but it is not a bouquet to Donald Trump's foreign policy. So that's the nature of the threat assessment. The fact that, as Jacob said, the fact that Trump is critical of the intelligence community is not new. Lots of presidents have fallen out of love with us over time. John Kennedy fell out of love with us immediately because of the Bay of Pigs, and then fell back in love after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Lyndon Johnson compared intelligence to the dirty end of a cow's tail swiping through a bucket of milk, which is not a pretty metaphor at lunch, but that was his metaphor. Richard Nixon, when he fired Richard Helms for not cooperating on Watergate and hired Jim Schlesinger to go after CIA, told him, take care of those clowns, which is not exactly an epithet you want. Nixon believed that the CIA had somehow been culpable in his defeat in 1960. George Bush fell out of love with us. Paul and I were at the agency in 2004. We were attacked. Paul was attacked personally. We were all attacked. In the Wall Street Journal, the vice president's people were attacking us, and we were accused of trying to help John Kerry get elected, which was not true. So they have fallen out of love with us in the past. It is not about love. But the relationship with Trump, as Jacob says, is different. We've never had a president stand up with a foreign leader, let alone a Russian foreign leader, and say, I believe him, I don't believe U.S. intelligence. We're saying, oh, I believe the Saudis, I don't believe what my intelligence people tell me. That I think, is very debilitating. And it's very bad for the relationship between the president and the intelligence community. So it is new and it is different. With some respect to Mr. Trump, the Worldwide Threat Assessment Testimony and Report does disagree with him. It doesn't disagree with his policies. We are not in the policy business. It disagrees with a lot of his premises, and that is valid. That is a valid thing to do. And if he actually read the Worldwide Threat Assessment, but apparently he does not read, he would have seen that. Now, so that's the DNI's set of priorities as he sees the world. It is at some level a predictive document, not entirely predictive. I mean, he makes a prediction on oil prices, but a lot of it's just sort of racking and stacking threats. Jim Clapper used to call it his doom-int briefing. You know, with ViewMint and SIGINT, he said this is doom-int. This is just this litany of everything that can go wrong. Now, the way they actually handle priorities is a different system. There's a system called the National Intelligence Priorities Framework, the NIPF, that Jim Clapper and I actually built when we were sleazy contractors. And then I came back to the government and inherited my own work, which is kind of interesting. And so this has been in effect since February 2003, so it's now 16 years old. We built it for President Bush, and it has survived through Bush, Obama, and now Trump, because we thought, and we turned out we were correct when we built it, it is a politically agnostic system. The goal of this system is to get the priorities of the senior policymakers, the President, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman, the people in the NSC. Because it's their priorities, it's not our priorities. The things that they're most worried about. And again, it's not a predictive system. You're trying to get from senior policymakers, what are your highest concerns? So typically there's now a meeting at the beginning of the year, no specific date, in the NSC. And then each quarter after that, the DNI and his staff, if Tunisia blows up in mid-year, Tunisia tell them to come back next week, we'll handle them then. So the DNI has the authority to go in and make adjustments as you go along, but the goal in this is to capture the policymakers' priorities. It's their priorities. And it is shared with the Congress. When we first built it, we were not allowed to share with the Congress. The two intelligence committees now get copies of the, there's this big grid that all the priorities go into, and it's called the Big Board, as in Dr. Strangelove, and this is my fault. The first time my guys built this thing, I said, "Oh my God, it's the Big Board," and the name stuck. My mother told me, "Think before you speak," and I just blew it out of time. Anyway, and so this is how they handle priorities at the executive level. Congress does have access to the NIPF, but they don't get to put in their own priorities. And the NIPF is important. This is how you're going to determine where do you put your collection assets, where do you put your analytical assets, and what is it you need that you don't have to meet those priorities. Congress has intervened at times between the Intelligence Committee and the President. When I was the staff director of the House Intelligence Committee, I was the first Republican staff director. This was after the Gingrich Revolution. And we turned around the budget. The budget had been declining since the end of the Cold War. Democratic Congresses had driven it down. Bill Clinton had driven it down. And we put in more money in the budget than Bill Clinton wanted, because we just felt that the intelligence capabilities needed to be rebuilt after this period of decline. We intervened a lot in my tenure against a then director of the CIA who's never allowed to be named. He's sort of like Lord Voldemort. Mr. Deutsch, and we did not get on well, and we spent a lot of time, we thought, protecting the intelligence community from John Deutsch. And so Congress can do this, but at the end of the day, it's the President's intelligence community. And so the fact that there's tension is not unusual. It's not even necessarily bad. Doing it in public, the way he does it, I think is actually very debilitating. Let me stop there.
Paul. Okay. All right. Thank you, Jacob. One can think of the intelligence policy relationship as leading a horse to water but not forcing it to drink. You can describe in detail what's in the water. You can reassure the horse that it's safe to drink the water. You can even warn the horse about what happens if he doesn't drink the water, but you can't make him drink it. Intelligence officers and agencies do not have any right to be heeded by policymakers. Sometimes I hear that phraseology, well, you have a right to be heard. It makes me cringe when I hear it. No, they have a duty, a responsibility to provide the best possible information and analysis to the policymakers, to give the policymakers decision advantage should they choose to use it. And the policymakers have not only the right but the responsibility to exercise their own judgment, not only on matters that go beyond the purview of the intelligence community, but also on those questions that are within the purview of the intelligence community. And something does not become an intelligence question in the first place if it is not subject to different interpretations, subject to information gaps, and subject to debate and discussion. There is a tendency to view a lot of foreign policy questions as hinging upon a particular intelligence judgment, even when they don't. And this, I think, is true of some of the issues that were highlighted in the press coverage of this most recent worldwide threat statement on ISIS, on North Korea, on Iran. What the intelligence chiefs said on those topics, and where the journalistic coverage noted the daylight between what was said and what the administration may be asserting, what the chief said was very much in line with what knowledgeable expert observers and analysts of those topics were already saying. So in a case like this, what the role that the intelligence community assumes is, in effect, not a source of information and insight for the rest of us in these unclassified statements, but rather as a kind of official ratifier, of certain inconvenient truths that the administration of the day might not accept. When it comes to a policy question like, say, what should become of the U.S. troop presence in Syria, it really does not hinge on some grand intelligence judgment about is ISIS defeated or not defeated. It instead, as a matter of counter-terrorist policy, is a much more complicated question having to do with things like, what relationship there is or is not between control over some patch of territory in Syria and the threat that a group like ISIS still does pose to us in the West. Now, whenever intelligence policy relations come up for discussion in a forum like this, the focus could be on either or both of two sorts of concerns. Concern number one would be, is the policymaker making full and effective use of that decision advantage that intelligence can provide? And the second kind of concern arises when we have policymakers already set on a course of action and making assertions and propagating propositions publicly that tend to support that course of action. And then we tend to look at the intelligence community the question we ask about it is, how are they playing into the larger debate in informing Congress and providing that official ratification of inconvenient truths that may be a counterweight to what the administration of the day is saying? As Mark mentioned, pathology in intelligence policy relations is nothing new. Sometimes that first concern I mentioned has come up. You know, there was the business about Nixon in 1960, and what the specific thing about that was Nixon's reported belief that he thought the CIA had not properly briefed candidate John Kennedy on the so-called missile gap, and disabuse him of the idea that there really was as much of a gap as was suspected. Kennedy went on to use that issue effectively, in Nixon's view, to contribute to his victory, and that's apparently what Mr. Nixon believed to his dying day. But I think the more disturbing instances are concern number two, where you have an administration set on a course of action, promoting a particular set of assertions to try to support that action, and then the question is, does the intelligence really support that? And I think in recent years, and I think that reflects the personal experience that Mark mentioned, the selling of the Iraq War leading up to the 2003 invasion was the most salient instance of that, to the point that the administration of the day went to great lengths to discredit intelligence judgments that did not support the case for war, you know, setting up a shop in the Pentagon to cull through the raw reporting to try to come up with an alternative case that there was some kind of alliance between the Iraqi regime and Al-Qaeda, you know, that sort of thing. So far in Donald Trump's presidency, I think the biggest concern seems to be, you know, Trump's overall resistance to ingesting new information in either written or briefing form, and thereby overcoming his ignorance about many world events. And his stated belief that he knows all he needs to know by watching the shows, especially on Fox. Now, obviously, this is relevant to intelligence policy relations, but it's not just limited to that. We're talking about all sources of information beyond Fox, and not just the intelligence community. Now, the intelligence community adjusts to the idiosyncrasies of each president, particularly in the daily briefing. John Walcott had a piece in Time this week in which he reported some of what the briefers are trying to do to adjust to Mr. Trump's idiosyncrasies. And it basically comes down to be blunt about it, dumbing things down with very short talking points and more graphics than words, that sort of thing. According to Walcott, also the briefers are trying to mention Mr. Trump as many times as possible, you know, in their briefing, to seize and hold his attention. Now, I don't know how successful, you know, these techniques are going to be. I don't expect that there is a scene very often in these presidential briefings in which Mr. Trump says, "Oh, gee, thanks, fellas, I hadn't realized that. I'm glad you briefed me on that." But so far, at least, in the current administration, we haven't had the kind of elaborate alternative analysis, debunk what the community is saying, that we did in the Iraq War instance that I just cited. Instead of having special units set up in the Pentagon to do that sort of thing, we have the usual sort of insulting presidential tweet that the intelligence chiefs are naive, they ought to go back to school, and so on. Maybe the more sophisticated kind of thing has yet to come. I would anticipate we might get it if we got closer to, say, a war with Iran. And there are some other disturbing parallels with regard to the run-up to the war in Iraq. One should note that we have, or the President has, as National Security Advisor in the person of Mr. Bolton, someone who is a veteran of efforts to intimidate and strong-arm intelligence officers to bring them around to his point of view. When he was Undersecretary of State, there was this episode in which he had a pet thesis about Cuba having a biological weapons program. And he tried to strong-arm intelligence analysts into agreeing with him on that, and when they refused to do so, his technique was to go to those officers' bosses and demand that they be fired. Now, how should the intelligence community respond to these sorts of things? Well, in the case of the Bolton kind of technique, it's actually relatively easy because it's so obviously ham-handed and crude and wrong that the bosses in question can quite comfortably stand their ground and say, no, I'm not going to fire those people just because they didn't accede to your judgment. What is far harder to handle is the more subtle and more common forms of politicization, such as questions continually being asked in one direction to try to uncover scraps that may support the assertions that the administration makes, and never asking questions in the other direction. Well, if you do that enough and keep asking those questions, the people that you're leaning on to dig up some scraps will probably eventually come up with something. I saw the other day that there was an order that went down to the Border Patrol to canvass Border Patrol officers to come up with some kind of evidence that would support the President's oft-repeated assertion that women are getting duct taped by smugglers of humans across the Mexican border. So the word went out, report up any instances of duct taped women. And probably if you ask that question often enough, they'll come up with some instance of that. But of course doesn't speak to whether the general proposition is true or not. Then there's just cherry picking of the reporting, the kind of thing that unit in the Pentagon was doing during the run-up to the Iraq War. Now, the intelligence community is duty-bound to answer the mail. When they get questions and requests from policymakers, they have to answer them. They have to respond to them. However tendentiously those questions and requests may have been selected. But they aren't limited just to doing that. Most of the work in the intelligence community is really self-initiated. It's not directly in response to a policymaker question. It's in response to the agency's own sense of what's important to U.S. interests and what problems are going to arise up the pike. And the worldwide threat testimony is probably the most comprehensive statement of that. So even if there's cherry picking and even if there's selective questions, other intelligence work can be done that gives a larger, more objective picture. But finally, the community has to be very careful not to be seen as going out of their way to poke a stick in the eye of the policymaker, however mistaken they may assess that the policymaker's public conclusions on some of these topics may be. One of the good things, well actually two of the good things about the worldwide threat statement is, number one, it's comprehensive, so it covers everything, things that the administration of the day is promoting and ones that it's not. It's got some things about borders, but it's got a lot about climate change and other stuff too. And it's also a regular annual thing. So, what those chiefs did a couple of weeks ago is not going out of their way to make statements publicly that the administration finds as inconvenient. They were simply doing their normal annual duty that they and their predecessors, as Mark explained, have been doing for years. Another technique, which I certainly used when I was in the service, was that of self-initiated work really being turned to not quite self-initiated by soliciting requests from policymaking components. At least you can say, no, we aren't going out of our way to poke a stick in your eye. It's because Assistant Secretary so-and-so asked the question, and we responded to it. Finally, the role of Congress in this is critical in my view. As a co-equal policymaking branch under Article 1 of the Constitution, as a requester and consumer and not just overseer of intelligence, I have tried to encourage members, whenever the occasion came up, to ask questions and levy tasks on the community early and often. Don't just wait until 3 weeks before some big vote to do it. I've been disappointed that overall members and committees have not been as active in that regard as they could be. When they do make a request, the request is taken very seriously. But the point is, that's another instance in which you're not talking about the community being placed in the uncomfortable position of having to take the initiative to put out inconvenient truths. They're responding to someone else's question. Of course, there is a hazard in being sucked up into the intense partisanship in Congress, and one of the last things that you as an intelligence chief would want to do is to come to be seen as a tool of the opposition party in Congress. So you have to be careful to avoid that. But my parting advice to officers and agency heads would still be stay in your lane. Whatever you may feel about the direction being set by the administration of the day, it is not up to you to save the republic. You do your job, and then it's up to people like our elected representatives in Congress to do theirs.
Thank you, Paul. George?
Thanks, Jacob. I'll make one quick biographic note, which I think is important for you all to know. I spent most of my career at CIA. I also did a tour at the White House on Vice President Cheney's staff. So I had a front row seat for a lot of the questions that Paul was talking about that were being directed at the agency. I was not one of those questioners. I was working on Russia issues, not Middle Eastern terrorism. But I did get an interesting view of that White House intelligence relationship from my perch over there. So I want to start out by restating the obvious, and that's that the state of the union between the White House and the intelligence community is not good. That's not remarkable, however. In and of itself, tensions are probably more the norm between the White House and the intelligence community over the years than they are the exception, as Mark and Paul have pointed out. I would agree, however, that the current relations between this White House and the intelligence community are much worse than even the normal state of tension. And I can go into a little bit as to why I think that. But what I really want to focus on is what are the implications of an open divide between the president and the intelligence community? Because I think they're quite significant. And I'm going to list a few of those that will hopefully spark some discussion. First of all, the switch agents. They want to do new things, adopt new approaches, provide new solutions. They're change agents. The intelligence community tends not to be. Career bureaucrats tend to be status quo players. They're comfortable with continuity, with the possible exception of making changes to organizational charts, which is a separate category in and of itself. Intelligence, however, has a duty, an obligation to warn about approaching storms. But presidents don't think they were elected to hand out umbrellas. They want to make it sunny. They don't want to react to weather. They want to make the weather nice. So there's an inherent tension in the roles that elected presidents and intelligence community officials play. There's no getting around that. And you see that played out to some degree in the public attitudes toward the intelligence community right now and toward President Trump right now. For people that believe that change is necessary, that U.S. policies in the world over the past several years have not been very successful, that we need a new approach, the idea that agents of the status quo might run some interference against somebody who's trying to move our country in a new direction in the world, that's not very welcome. For people that think that Trump is misguided, that the status quo is more or less okay, they look at the potential for the intelligence community acting as a brake on this, a check and a balance on that kind of change as a welcome thing. So it depends on your overall attitude toward what we ought to be doing in the world as to where you come down on that. But I think what we've got now is an order of magnitude beyond what's normal and healthy on this. What we have, I think, is really open warfare between the intelligence community and the president. It's not just a disagreement over the role we ought to be playing in the world and the policies we ought to be adopting and how we understand the dynamics on various issues in various regions. It's the belief that, on the president's part, the intelligence community really wants to see him out of office, that he was illegitimately elected, that he has no business being president. That's the kind of perception that reasonable people can't really find a compromise over. This is an existential question, not a matter of debate. When the president sees the intelligence community in that way, that's a big problem. So one of the implications of this is intelligence warning becomes much more difficult. Now, why do I say that? Intelligence warning is the most important intelligence mission. CIA was created because of Pearl Harbor. It was created because we realized we needed an organization whose primary purpose was to reduce the likelihood of strategic surprise. But intelligence warning is not just dependent on intelligence officers. It's actually a relationship function. And the reason why I say that is if the intelligence community warns, but its audience for that warning won't hear it, dismisses it, effectively, the result is no different than if there were no warning at all. You've got to deliver warning in a way that your audience can hear and understand, if not necessarily always agree with. You have to have a relationship in order to do that. You need access, first of all. You need someone that can provide you with the opportunity to deliver a message. And you've got to have enough of a relationship that your audience can hear what you're saying and understand it. So building a relationship with the president that's functional, and vice versa, from the president's point of view, having a relationship with intelligence that is functional, at least at some level, is part of the job, is part of the requirement. And in any relationship, that's a two-way street. Both sides have a role in that relationship. When that relationship is broken, that warning function doesn't work. And we all pay the price for that sort of breakdown. The country's national security suffers in situations like that. That's not a trivial thing. Second implication, when you have that open warfare, it can affect intelligence judgments and it can affect policy judgments. Intelligence professionals are trained to be as objective as possible. They strive to be as objective as possible. They are open-minded about evaluating evidence, considering alternative explanations, identifying what we don't know, trying to bound uncertainties. But when your professional judgment is impugned, when you're denigrated, when you're personally derided, it inevitably has an effect on those judgments. Normal human reaction to that situation is to focus on evidence that proves you're right. Right? You said I was dumb, I was naive, I need to go back to school, but look, here, can't you see that I'm justified in this particular judgment? This works both ways. It has that effect on the part of intelligence, but it also has the same effect on the side of policymakers, who, when they perceive that they're under attack, do exactly the same kind of thing. It's called confirmation bias. We're all susceptible to it. It's probably the single biggest cognitive problem that the U.S. national security enterprise suffers from. And it occurs not just in the intelligence world, but on the policy world. And when you have this kind of open warfare, it makes that kind of problem even worse than it normally is. Third, in conditions of open warfare like this, it makes the exposure of national security secrets much more likely. We all know that leaks are the tool of choice in Washington warfare. We also know that obviously leaks have a terrible impact on our ability to protect secrets and information that need to be protected. But I think leaks also have a self-reinforcing effect. They add to mistrust and suspicions. Once you get into these conditions of open warfare and leaking becomes more common, it tends to cause an escalatory spiral in hostility between the executive branch and the rest of the bureaucracy. So it's not just a problem of protecting secrets, it's a problem that exacerbates all other aspects of the relationship. So very quickly, a couple of points on what can be done about all this. I'm going to echo something that both Paul and Mark alluded to. Public quarreling is a very damaging thing. Arguments over national security issues, in my opinion, inside, due to arguing within a closed, contained, non-public environment. Now, one thing that my colleagues on the panel might not agree with, but I will throw out there to be a bit provocative, is I don't think the intelligence community should be publishing reports and analysis nearly as often as it has been. The pendulum has been swinging over the years toward more and more unclassified publications coming out. I don't think very much that is good has come of that. I'm a big believer in keeping Congress, the oversight committees, fully informed and briefed on things, but issuing public versions of NIEs, unclassified intelligence community judgments, actually tends to fuel the public aspects of these debates. And I'm not a fan of the impact that that has had. Second thing I would say, the intelligence community needs to show its math in its work. Basically, the more transparent it can be about the methodology that it is using to reach judgments, the more it considers in its work alternative explanations, tries to bound uncertainties, emphasizes the impact of what we don't know and what is unknowable in many cases on judgments, the more that contributes, A, to better analysis, more accurate analysis on the one hand, but on the other hand, it also sends a very important message to the policymaking community, and that is we're not trying as an intelligence community to throw our weight behind one particular policy preference. We're considering a broad range of things. We're being as objective as possible. That doesn't solve the problem by itself of policymakers thinking that you're biased and you have a policy agenda, but it can certainly help to chip away at that perception. And perceptions of bias are almost as debilitating as the reality of actual bias. So I will leave it at that.
Well, those were three excellent presentations, and I will kick off the questions with one of my own, which is, when the intelligence chiefs testified recently before Congress, did they in fact go too far? Were they lurching into political judgments, for example, about North Korea? Was Trump right, in fact, to be indignant that they were straying into his territory, even if the way he expressed himself was beyond the pale?
My short answer, Jacob, is no. I don't see anything they said in that statement that went beyond their ken in terms of what they're being asked to judge on. And I emphasize the responsibilities of the community extend to foreign capabilities and foreign intentions. Now, when you get into intentions, then you immediately, with an issue like North Korea, have to speak conditionally, and an awful lot of those judgments that the chiefs provided were conditional ones. If basically saying, if the U.S. does this, then adversary A may react in certain ways, or adversary B may react in certain ways. You can question those judgments. They're ones that by their very nature, are not going to be backed up by some specific piece of reporting unless there was, a exceptionally well-placed source in, Kim Jong-un's decision-making circles. But no, I don't see anything where they went beyond their proper kin.
I agree. They were doing their job. I mean, maybe it's certainly something the president doesn't want to hear. No, they're not going to completely denuclearize, but there's nothing wrong with making that call. I mean, the question you get asked more often than not by policymakers is exactly the question that Paul just touched on. Leadership intentions. What are these people about? What are they going to do? Where are they coming from? And so to say something like, we do not believe that Kim Jong-un is likely to completely denuclearize is a valid intelligence judgment. Now, clearly, it's not something the president wants to hear, because he's the world's greatest deal maker, and he can talk anybody into anything, apparently. But that's an important thing to say. It's important for him to say that there's been irreversible damage to the ecosystem. That's a call. That's a judgment call. I think they were doing their job. The president didn't like it. No policymaker likes to be told that premises are wrong. Paul called it poking a stick in their eye. When I worked at the State Department's INR, we called it pissing on the policymaker's pants legs. Which was nice because it was alliterative. Now, you want to do that judiciously. You don't want to do it promiscuously, but occasionally it's your job to tell the emperor, sir, it is cold and raining and you're a little bit underdressed for the weather. I think that's part of our job. Now, the problem is there are two fights in Washington you can never win. If you're in the executive branch, you can never win a fight with the president. I don't care who the president is. He has more battalions and more aces in his deck than you do, and you can never win a fight with Congress. People have tried it and they've always lost. So, I mean, at the end of the day, this is not a relationship of equals. The way I explain this to my classes is the rhinoceros and the bird that lives on the back of the rhino. I think it's called the dik-dik bird. His job is to eat parasites that are on the back of the rhino. The rhino can live without the bird. He'll be itchy, but he'll survive. The bird cannot live without the rhino. The policymaker is the rhino. We are the bird. And you have to know where you are in the hierarchy, or the lower hierarchy, as one of my staff used to call it. So it's not a relationship of equals. It's his policies, whoever he is, at the end of the day. But you have the right to say, sir, I've done this in meetings. I'm one of the people John Bolton wanted fired, by the way, after I gave him one briefing, and I was told when I got back, he put the call into CIA before I got back to the building. I was on route from state. And I was told, you get in line. There are 40 people he wants fired, and you're not leaving ahead of your turn. Because I give him a briefing he didn't like on intelligence priorities. Anyway, so yeah, I think they were in bounds. I think they were. I think the president's reaction was out of bounds. And then there's that lovely hostage-taking picture of him with Dan Coates and Gina Haspel and Director Ray sitting in front of the desk, and it should have been labeled woodshed. I mean, I would love to have had the sound in that picture. What the hell were you people doing out there? But one of the problems with President Trump reminds me of what Talleyrand said about the Bourbons when they returned to power in 1815. They have learned nothing and they have forgotten nothing. And that's a very difficult person to have to brief on a regular basis.
George? Well, at the risk of conveying an impression of unanimity, I will agree. When I looked at the actual worldwide threat briefing statement, and I did this after reading the press coverage of all of this and playing up all the ways the intelligence chiefs had contradicted Trump's policy preferences, and I looked at what they said on North Korea, I thought, wow, actually, number one, their judgment on North Korea was unremarkable. It was basically continuity. Something the intelligence community, I believe, has been saying for quite some time about the likelihood of North Korean denuclearization. But number two, what struck me was how the statement actually changed in North Korea in the last few years. It had not done a number of the provocative things that it had been doing before. So in terms of eye-poking, it was, I think, an abysmal failure. It seemed to be crafted in such a way to be quite acceptable, I think, both analytically and as a relationship management statement with the president. I will say one thing, however. The intelligence community generally doesn't like to think about the conditions under which unlikely things might actually happen. And that's led to some surprises over the years. The fall of the Berlin Wall. That was something that was a surprise. It was something that most experts had a hard time imagining, for reasons that had a lot to do with some, very deeply baked in conventional wisdom and assumptions about what the Soviet Union would and would not tolerate. We did not spend a lot of time thinking about what kinds of things might cause change. And when it comes to North Korea, it's easy to imagine all the things that would prevent serious change there. It's more difficult to think about what could surprise us, what would have to occur to cause things to move in a different direction. So that's not a criticism of the Worldwide Threat Briefing statement. I think that that's beyond the scope of a statement like that to get into. But it is, I think, a more general comment that the intelligence community could do a little bit more in that area to consider things that are important to consider, and in so doing, help policymakers that are looking for ways to bring about change.
Excellent. So who's going to fire off the first question from our audience? General Gregson.
Thanks. The sainted James Lilly once called North Korea the hardest target. And speaking of George's points on discontinuity, is there room for investigation of other phenomena? In other words, North Korea runs a worldwide criminal network, and they've got legal businesses around the world. They have illegal businesses around the world. Everybody's shoveling money at the center in North Korea. They profit greatly from proliferation of WMD and counterfeit $100 bills and you name it. You know all this better than I do. But is there a way to, through liaison arrangements and things, to start figuring out how we can start drying this up, helping local governments to export their Korean workers back home like the UN called for, and coming at this intelligence problem with North Korea the other way around, instead of a total focus on the DPRK itself, start working on their external organs that support the center.
The problem is China. China will keep the DPRK alive as long as they can. As you know this better than I do, General, the last thing they want is united Korea on the Yalu that happens to be a U.S. ally. So they will push the North Koreans a little bit, but they want that there. They want that buffer there. And I think the answer it lies in Beijing. And Beijing is not going to do a lot about it. So I think that's the real problem. I mean, they'll allow us to sort of do marginal things to North Koreans, try and cut down on illegal smuggling, cut down drug, but they will never allow you to end up in a situation where, like the Maduro government in Venezuela, which is on its last leg. They would never allow that to happen in Pyongyang. That's my firm belief. They will keep that. They want a buffer between our allies and us and their boundary. That's my view on it.
Anyone else?
Well, insofar as it's an intelligence issue, we would say, number one, these are all clearly appropriate topics for collection and analysis by the community. But that leads me to a further thought about a repeated challenge that the community has faced and sometimes has failed at, and that is using the results of its collection and analysis on a diverse set of topics. And these other North Korean activities, they get into organized crime, drugs, counterfeiting. Well, you've got different parts of agencies like CIA and NSA that cover those things. And it's a further challenge of management and aggregation to make sure that all that information is properly focused for like the sort of effort that you mentioned, as aimed at another way of getting at the North Korean problem. So there may well be very useful information, let's say about drugs, that the Crime and Narcotics Center has collected, and they're looking at it as a drug issue. But it behooves the managers in the intelligence community, as I say, sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail. I could give you some fail stories that I've been involved in making sure that that information is applied to a policy task like the one you identified. That's, you know, given the number of topics, the number of agencies, that's not easy to do, but it's a responsibility of the community to try to do it.
Every intelligence agency that I know around the world divides its analysts in two groups. You have regional analysts, you have topical analysts. And the goal, as Paula just said, is to get them to talk to each other. You need both. I need somebody who understands the drug trade. I need somebody who understands the economy of North Korea. And I have to make sure that they talk. This has always been a problem, is getting them to talk across those intellectual stovepipes, if you will. I mean, this is something I spent a lot of my time on in various places. And it is this problem. It really depends a lot on good management, as Paul said, and on good interpersonal relationships among analysts and collectors.
I'll give you my biggest failure story. I mean, back in the 90s, when I had responsibilities for overseeing counterterrorist analysis. Remember the Aum Shinrikyo poison gas attack in Tokyo subway in 1995? We missed it. I say we, I'm talking about the unit I was in charge of. Partly it was just we were grossly under-resourced in terms of analysts following extremist groups in East Asia. It was embarrassingly small. But part of it was this stovepiping issue. We certainly had analysts who covered, you know, internal affairs in Japan who knew an awful lot about Aum Shinrikyo, but they weren't looking at it from a counter-terrorist, international terrorism point of view. That's the kind of problem and challenge I'm talking about.
Just a very quick comment on this. I'll make a broad sweeping assertion. The larger your intelligence community gets and the more specialized it gets, the more difficult this problem becomes. Integrating narrow expertise in various stovepipes is harder and harder the more you slice these issues more and more narrowly. Now, that's a problem when the world becomes increasingly interconnected, and it is becoming increasingly interconnected. Our information environment, it no longer respects national boundaries, and technologies no longer respect these national boundaries. And so the challenges of integration between people that understand malware payloads and national strategic intentions and relationships between governments and various segments within their societies becomes a very difficult problem to handle organizationally.
We had a question down here.
So this question is for George in the first instance, but I'll be very interested in hearing thoughts from Mark and Paul as well. So George, you recommended that the IC needed to be sort of show its methodology, show its homework in its analyses, which I think any sensible person would think is a good idea. But that's basically appealing to logic and evidence. That's appealing to logos and persuasion. And nobody who's human is fully persuaded by that, and this president particularly not so, I would argue. So I guess I'd ask, perhaps slightly provocatively, is there any effective and ethical role for appealing to pathos, to emotion, in persuading either this president or presidents more generally, and it may well be that the answer is different, of the validity of our intelligence analyses?
Well, I will say I very much agree with you. Logic and argumentation generally is not very effective in changing people's minds. It's very good at getting people who already are inclined to agree with you to feel that they agree with you even more strongly than they did before. But seldom do you take someone that's opposed in some way and convince them through logic and evidence that they need to see things in a different way. That's right. my point was not that you would change minds. My point was that you send a more subtle message. I'm trying to be objective. I'm trying to consider alternatives. And you can't do that and simultaneously come across as what I really want to do is torpedo your agenda, because you have to consider the facts, the logic, the arguments, the bounds of uncertainty that also allow for an alternative approach to these issues. Now, in terms of understanding the role of emotion in managing relationships, I think emotion is critical to that. Now, I couldn't offer you a generalization about how you use the softer side of things to manage a relationship. That almost by definition has to be a fingertip kind of thing that depends very much on the particular people and the particular circumstances. But I would fully endorse your suggestion that paying attention to that side of things is very important.
I'm agnostic on George's recommendation, because I don't think most people, first of all, our methodology isn't something that you can show like, all right, this is how I got the square root of 3 is an answer. It doesn't track that way. It's something that analysts begin to understand sort of intuitively if they're decent analysts, but it's very hard to show, and I'm not sure they would persuade anyone. I always tell analysts, nobody wants to see your data. The general is not going to sit for, in fact, I had the J2 at Centacom tell me, I don't want data. I want an analyst standing in front of my desk who knows what she's talking about. I don't want data. And I think the methodology sort of runs into that, and my sense is you're not going to persuade the unpersuadable. And it also runs counter to George's other suggestion about less transparency. We actually stopped publishing the key judgments of NIEs when Mike McConnell was the DNI under George Bush, and McConnell said exactly what George says, that we're just becoming political footballs. And then the Iran estimate came up, and that was the next one in the queue. And McConnell said to the president, we're not publishing that. And he said, are you kidding? Yes, you are. And he said, but you said, he said, yeah, but this one's going to leak, and I'm not getting involved in that. This one you're publishing. But we actually did stop publishing because they had become terrible political footballs, and everyone, the Democrats were cherry picking them, the Republicans cherry picking them, and that was also very debilitating. I mean, you would see analysts afraid to write a valid key judgment for fear of where that was going to go on Capitol Hill or on CNN.
If the issue is using, I think you said using pathos, it's very difficult for intelligence officers to use pathos explicitly and maintain what I would consider their professionalism. The ideal intelligence officer should be like Mr. Spock, devoid of emotion. And in fact, when I was in a position to review and edit papers, one thing I consistently edited out was the terminology, we are concerned that, and whatever the problem was. My response is, nobody gives a crap about what our concern is. That's not our job. I think the closest you can come to it is, say if you've got some humanitarian disaster, okay, you give the facts and figures about how many children are starving and whatnot, and maybe you could even have a sidebar box in your briefing paper that gives a couple of cases, and that might, tug at the heartstrings, but you can't go beyond that. But this is related to this other issue about publicly documents that Mark did earlier. My position is to be more upfront about it. I think I perhaps do disagree with my colleagues on this a bit. And I think the problem is because the public releases, except for something regular like the Worldwide Threat Statement, have been irregular and relatively infrequent on hot topics, then when they do happen, this is seen as going out of the way of the intelligence agencies to piss on the policymakers' pants or inject themselves into a policy debate. I think if it was done more regularly, then that would be less of a problem. Now, I immediately qualify that with this other related issue, and that's showing your work. Because, for protecting sources and methods, you can't show most of the work. And so I admit that is a downside. I think that was a downside, for example, of the unclassified statement that the community leaders under Clapper put out in January 2017 on the Russian interference in the election issue. Because I've seen an awful lot of criticism of that statement, saying, well, this is all general, there's not specific evidence here. And I have to remind people, that was the unclassified summary, That wasn't the assessment, which we haven't seen. That's classified. That's got all the good stuff in it. How much good stuff, we don't know, unless you got a clearance and you read it. So I admit that's a problem. But it's also a problem, and Mark alluded to that Iran estimate in 2007, of leaks. And I am quite confident that the juicy quotes from that one would have
Oh,
leaked
absolutely, absolutely.
if they hadn't released the unclassified footage.
Now, I have to say that I have a different take on the election assessment, because I read that, and I read it really closely, and part of it, they lifted a paper that I had Bob Walpole write and put it back in there. I went, oh my God, really? I mean, my feeling was that if you knew what you were reading, that was really a breathtaking assessment. Now, they didn't spill sources and methods in an overt way, but my sense was they came as close to the line as you could, in an unclassified basis. I really was taken aback by how I read it. So it's the eye of the beholder, Mark.
We have a question from Graham Allison right here.
Can I get a microphone? So, great presentation and a great topic. I want to ask about the significance of the stress in the relationship currently in the Trump administration. And go back to George's proposition that, if I quoted here, that the intelligence community wants him out of office. That's what Trump believes. That's what you said. Okay, so I think Trump believes three things. So first, that a significant number of members of the intelligence community believe that he's illegitimate, that he only is the president because of Russian interference in the election. And there's some people who believe that, might include Jim Clapper, who says that now. So two, that they want him out of office. I think I've heard that from some members and former members of the intelligence community. And three, that they're actively colluding or collaborating with members of the opposition who are investigating him, and with members of the press who are hoping to impeach him, to get him out of office. So I think his sort of nightmare is Richard Nixon. And when Richard Nixon, in his paranoia, thought that members of the intelligence community, maybe even the FBI, were providing information to newspapers to help impeach him, as Kissinger said, even paranoids have enemies. You know?
If it's only delusional paranoia is a problem. Other paranoia may be well suited.
So, spoken by like a true intelligence officer.
No, or the husband of a psychotherapist, either way.
So the question is, if this is roughly correct, so what, okay, in terms of what we care about, which is the country and our interests and the risks or the dangers.
But this was the issue that I raised earlier. In 2004, the Bush administration, George's boss, the vice president, the Wall Street Journal, was convinced that we were working for John Kerry. And there were these daily barrages. And you, unfortunately, were one of the main targets where somebody had violated a rule. Paul had given a speech, and it was supposed to be, closed session, and the publisher, it wasn't his fault. He was one of the targets. And this got to the point, I mean, it was every day. And it got to the point where John McLaughlin, who was the acting director, George had already retired, went to the White House to see Andy Card, the chief of staff, and said, Andy, we can't work this way. We are not working to elect John Kerry. We are not trying to defeat the president, and you have to call up your dogs. I mean, that's pretty severe, to have the head of the community have to go to the White House and say that. So we have had other moments of the type of describing.
So I'm interested in the I'm not saying, I think there are analogs, and that's a great analog. The question is, therefore, what should the rest of us be concerned about? That doesn't sound like a very functional relationship.
Well, yeah, I think you put your finger on exactly the problem. I think that, in a nutshell, describes how I understand the perceptions in the White House about intelligence community aims, and I think the implications are quite big. Now, part of the implications have to do with our national security, our ability to conduct effective foreign policy, to deal with the threats in the world that we have to deal with. And the state of our ability to do that is impaired, I think, is a fair adjective right now. But I think they have much bigger implications that have to do with the state of the republic, democratic governance, the ability to hold legitimate elections, to respect institutional authority. So those implications are quite profound.
Let me flip this question, and maybe Paul, you can respond to this. How many, and build on Graham's question, how many members in the intelligence community think that it is not because Trump is a doofus that he is not listening to them, but because it is not in his interest to listen to them?
That's it.
That he is not operating in good faith?
Well, there's probably all kinds of conjectures around the water coolers, you know, in the aisles, in the halls of those agencies on that question, Jacob. But I think the main response is those people go back to their cubicles and say, well, whatever the motives, this is what we know about how he operates. This is what the briefers tell us the sessions go. So here's how we have to craft the presentation to have the best chance of getting through whatever his motives are. And I think in response to what you and other members of the public most ought to worry about, I think George addressed that quite well in his prepared comments about when you have this distrust and the warning relationship, and it really is a relationship between intelligence and policy, breaks down. And the policymaker, the suspicious policymaker, the one who thinks all those deep state people are trying to elect my opponent, whenever those people then come to him with warning of some problem, the first thought going through his mind is, well, they're playing some game to try to make trouble for me. And this pertains to an observation that quite a few analysts, I think, have made about the Trump presidency so far, these 2 years, that he has not really been tested with a true international crisis, or at least not one of his own making. And yeah, like fire and fury in North Korea, you know. And so we aren't at war at North Korea because he got elected. But if we had a real crisis, there's been a lot of commentary about, you know, the disorder and the decision-making process in the White House and so on. Well, this is another thing to worry about. That the intelligence input would be discredited, it would be seen with suspicious eyes, and that would impede an effective and safe response to whatever the crisis is.
Well, we have a question from Walter Pincus was next.
I just want to take Graham Allison's idea and turn it around a little bit. I've never seen a president so openly go after the community, starting with the campaign. And I think you have to sort of factor in the intelligence community is not popular with his constituency. And so the possibility he's doing this for his own political reasons, because you attack the community, forget what it does in policy. It helps him with his constituency. And there's a whole sort of left community that is also open to that. So that, because it's so unusual, and I just wanted to, I think the classic, looking at it from a press person, the classic example was when you refer to that picture after, the day after the community testified. And his answer was two things. One, they told me it was the press that misstated their points of view. But more important, he said, go ask them, and they'll tell you that. Well, you know, nobody's going to tell him that. But he appears to his community that, you know, they agreed with him. So he's misstating in public What is
Not the
your
first time.
advisors supposedly told him?
Look, the intelligence community has no constituency outside of Washington, D.C. I worked at the State Department. They have no constituency either. But the even Graham's right. I mean, you know this, Walter. There is no constituency in the body politic for U.S. intelligence. When I was on the staff of the HIPSI, and you were still at the Post, Chairman Larry Combest said to me early on in our relationship, he said, "You know what the public wants from U.S. intelligence?" I said, "What's that, sir?" He said, "They want to know when they go to bed in the morning, they're going to wake up in the same country tomorrow." And we lost that one Tuesday morning. But that, there is no constituency abroad for U.S. intelligence, and there's never going to be. We do what we do. Some people tolerate it, some people accept it, and some people can't stand the idea. And that's just it's the Harry Truman thing. You want a friend, you get a dog. That's just, who we are in the body politic and in the government, and I think we accept that going in. But you're right, there is, if you're on the far right and the far left, there can always be a faction of people. Don't trust us, don't like us, would like to see us go away. I think that's absolutely true.
I'm sure you're right, Walter, in analyzing the politics of it. I think much of what this discussion has touched on in looking at past as well as present instances of discord between the incumbent president and his administration and the intelligence community is, it's not so much degrees of distrust and hatred and so on, because we've had some pretty strong degrees in the past, but how the particular political and personality circumstances of the person at the top governs the response. We talked about Nixon and the CIA in '60. Well, all right, Mr. Nixon and his partner Henry Kissinger had, with very good reason, high confidence in their own intelligence and knowledgeability and sophistication when it came to understanding the world. And so their response was just forget about the bureaucracy. Their most important initiatives like the opening of China. In the case of Bush 43, they didn't have those kinds of credentials, so they needed to dress up their big initiative with intelligence, making it look like this war we're going to fight is driven by intelligence even when it wasn't. Hence the effort to try to cherry pick and make the case. With the current president, I think we haven't seen that so far, mainly because his technique in appealing to his base is just to lie and to use the power of repetition to get people to believe things. Even to believe that when you have a televised hearing, the problem was that people were misquoted.
It's the Joseph Goebbels.
So what varies here is not so much the degree of distrust and hatred of the agencies. It's the particular politics and personality of the administration in question and how they respond.
Just a brief comment. I would say that the president is not necessarily using the intelligence community per se to appeal to his base. I think he's running against the Washington establishment, and particularly the national security establishment writ large, what has been referred to as the blob, which many people associate with what the president again has called endless wars. So that has been effective, that has appeal, but I don't think there's a large anti-intelligence community establishment out in Akron, Ohio that somehow finds all this very appealing.
We have a question from Wayne Mary, who's been waiting patiently.
Always patient. Terrific panel, by the way, really first class. But I'd like to present the panel with a conundrum, and it's a real-world conundrum with a very different kind of president. George Herbert Walker Bush, former DCI. It's the second half of 1991, and we're talking about the end of the Soviet Union, which I got to see up close and personal in Moscow. But before I went to Moscow, I saw George Colt at CIA. I got to read that famous memo, The Soviet Conundrum.
Cauldron.
Cauldron. I remember sitting on his sofa reading it. Brilliant piece of erudition. It didn't get it right. I talked to the people in the White House. They told me that Gorbachev had reached the end of his capacity. He was going to be in for years, 5 to 10 years of drift in the Soviet Union. When George Herbert Walker Bush listened to his DCI, his chief of staff, all these other people, he got it wrong. The one person who advised him, who actually had access to him, who got it right, was his ambassador in Moscow. Bob Strauss, who had no background in intel, no background in Russia affairs, but had two things. One, the most superlative instincts for political power I have ever seen in my life, supposedly rivaling those of Lyndon Johnson, if not exceeding them. And second, a capacity to listen to his deputy, Jim Collins, to his staff, including me, and to the Russians he talked to, and to figure out who was hot and who was not. In October, in Madrid, he sat down with the president and all of his advisors, and he said, Mr. President, I'm the last U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union. I'm going to be the first U.S. ambassador to a place called Russia. And all of the other people around the table said, wrong, 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 wrong. Sununu in rather insulting terms, which provoked Bob to a somewhat earthy Texas response. Question. Here's the President of the United States dealing with what is the most important geopolitical issue he will ever deal with. And the one person he should be listening to is somebody he's known for decades and respects, but he's getting a totally different perspective from that man than from his DCI, his Chief of Staff, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and Vice President, all the rest of it. Conundrum. This is not Donald Trump. This is perhaps the most prepared for foreign affairs president of my lifetime, or any of our lifetimes, with possible exception to Dwight Eisenhower. Conundrum. What should he do?
There was one other intelligence agency that really got this badly wrong. That was the KGB. And they were a lot closer to the target than we were. You always have to keep that in mind. I mean, that's why he gets paid the big bucks. No, I'm saying, but he wasn't too thrilled about the prospect either. Remember the Chicken Kiev speech, as the late Bill Sapphire called it, where he told the Ukrainians, let's not be too hasty about trying to leave the Union.
In December, when Gorbachev was getting all the phone calls from Washington telling him not to step down.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I remember that.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I had this conversation once with former Secretary McNamara, where there's certain events that happen that you really can't believe what you're seeing was a run so counter to everything you've known. And this came up with McNamara at a dinner after they had discovered that the Soviets actually did have nuclear weapons in, I'm saying this in front of Graham Allison, it's really stupid, did have nuclear weapons in Cuba, and that the local commanders had release authority, and McNamara had said to the Russians and Cuba and the Cubans at their reunion, well, if we'd known that, everything would have been different. I said, with respect, sir, no, it wouldn't. He said, what are you talking about? I said, you wouldn't have believed it at the time. You would have rejected it as being impossible and wrong, and you would have gone on playing. It was no American would do that. That's insane. You're going to give a local commander release authority against their main enemy? So I think certain events happen that you reject out of hand because everything that you see tells you no. But then, that's why, as I said, that's why the president gets paid. He's got to make the call.
A couple of comments. One is, I suspect that Mr. Bush, given that unusual background of having been the DCI during the last year of the Ford administration, and thus having a far better understanding of intelligence and its limitations than any other person who's entered the Oval Office, was exceptionally well prepared to know when and when not to, bet the mortgage on what your intelligence chiefs are telling you. And to respond appropriately. And I would suggest, hope you don't disagree, that Mr. Bush did a pretty darn good job of managing the end of the Cold War.
Absolutely.
I mean, one other name I would mention in commendation from that period is James Baker. Yes. And if you read Baker's memoir, and he talks about getting briefed by intelligence types, Bob Blackwell, my late friend, and others on the Soviet Union, and what might happen to it, and Baker then emphasizing the necessity of not placing all our chips on one possibility and having to keep open multiple possibilities and maximizing U.S. advantage if this happens as well as if that happens. The other comment I would make, and you mentioned Bob Strauss's insight on this, I think those who have had intense domestic political experience, either as an elected politician or in the business of domestic politics, I found often have a very, very good sense of politics overseas. In a way that goes beyond what the typical political analyst of the CIA does. I was once one myself, so I don't speak ill of them. I'll name another name. Porter Goss, who, the last DCI before the reorganization, who didn't get very good press. But I found in my interactions with him when he was at Langley, when questions came up about political events overseas, he had a pretty good sense of the sorts of questions that had to be asked, and I was favorably impressed. I mean, here was somebody who was involved in elective politics himself, and I think that stood him well. And some of what Strauss brought to the issue of how to interpret events in Russia or the Soviet Union, I think were a similar dynamic.
Can I add one other point? I was working at State INR at the time, and I was at that point I was at DAS, and I found that one of my problems with my Soviet analysts was they literally could not conceive of there not being a Soviet Union. I'm a Soviet analyst, therefore there has to be a Soviet Union. I used to say that you know their future is not based on your career track. I mean they literally could not conceive. So we had this seminar. This was in '86, and we were discussing what was happening in the Soviet Union. And I said, "Let me tell you how this ends." And they said, "What?" I said, "Well, one night the Politburo is going to have a meeting, and the next day they can say, Misha, we took a vote. You weren't in the room. You lost." I said, "It's going to be like Khrushchev. They're going to throw him out." And they said, "Who's going to do that?" And I said, "KGB, Ministry of Defense, the party." And they said, "You know what your problem is?" I said, "What?" They said, "You don't know anything about the Soviet Union." I said, "No, your problem is you know too much about the Soviet Union." No, so I think the people you're describing, it was inconceivable, but also historically, we had never seen a multi-ethnic empire go down peacefully absent war or tremendous internal trauma. There is no precedent for that. I was trained as a historian. I mean, this is not the Ottomans, the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns in 1918. So, and then thinking about that with a state that has nuclear weapons and 4 constituent republics, it's really ugly to think about. I mean, I remember what the thought pattern was back here. You were in Moscow. You were.
We have one question here, and then I'm going to bundle the last 3 or 4 because we're running out of time. And Gil, you're not going to make the cut.
Thanks for letting me know.
Right here.
Thanks. Thank you. Chung Pak, I'm from Brookings. I recently left the CIA and now the Korea chair at Brookings. I push back, one of the frustrating things about the idea of deep state in the IC is that policy support is baked into your performance evaluation. And so to keep saying the same thing about North Korea is not going to denuclearize, you're going to get 0 reads. We pour over these responses or how our pieces would be taken by the policy community, including the president, and we pour over little snippets of things like read with interest to go into our performance evaluation. And so and because of the incentive is to support the policy, you have to be creative to get that good, strong remarks and the strong responses from the policy community. So, I'm pretty certain that there are lots of creative juices flowing and about what it would, all the 3 or 5 steps that would need to be in place or conditions that would need to be in place before that assessment changes. So I'm pretty sure that that's happening right now. So I push back a little bit on that. And also on the stovepiping, since the reorganization, there's a Korea Mission Center, there's an East Asia Pacific Mission Center, there's an Iran Mission Center. And in these cases, it's a way of trying to get rid of the stovepiping. But of course, there are issues of classification and who has access to what. But I'd say that I think it has made a big impact on getting all those the functional and the regional analysts together to talk about these various measures. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
All right, we have a slew of questions now, so I think we'll start with Doyle, and then there are 2, one from Ode and one right here, and then a 4th over in the corner.
Doyle McManus from the LA Times. I want to go back just one more time to George Beebe's point that the intelligence community needs to work on building a relationship with its consumer. When Mike Pompeo went to CIA, he made it an explicit, virtually public piece of his mission to repair the institutional relationship and build a direct relationship to the president. Now, we know that Mike Pompeo is good at building relationships because he did build a relationship between Mike Pompeo and President Trump. It's not clear he managed to repair the relationship with the community. So, if not, why not? What are the lessons of that episode? Is it a lost cause, or is there any advice you can offer his successors?
We got to take the next questions right here. We're running short.
Same line. Mr. Beebe talked about what the intelligence community needs to do to fix these things. But is this relationship sunk forever, given the roots of the Russia investigation in the intelligence and counterintelligence community, and how Trump is at the center of that? What can be done to repair the relationship, if anything at all?
O'Day. Right. The microphone's right next to you.
Trump the other day talked about the base in Iraq, Ain al-Assad, and he said we're there to monitor Iran, and he talked about how big the base is. Now, would such words undermine the work of the intelligence community?
And we have a fourth question here in the corner.
Yeah. I can stand up. Craig Allen, U.S.-China Business Council. I'm somewhat perplexed by the conflation of China and Russia in the national security strategy and the national defense strategy. Clearly, they're different countries. Clearly, they're different threats. Putting them together, Paul, I was struck by your comments. Is that a reflection of a political bias there? Perhaps it's a false premise. These are different countries. Why don't we treat them differently? Thank you.
All right, last one from Jill. I've decided to be merciful.
Jill. Hey, if I could ask you all, there was a lot of talk during the Obama administration about how CIA had become too tactical, had become focused on manhunting and drone strikes and targets to be prosecuted rather than recruited. Has there been a swing back at all in the Trump administration as we supposedly focus more on Russia and China?
The answers are yes, no, yes, no, yes. Your question first. I didn't read the worldwide threat assessment the way you did. I didn't see them conflating the two. They just said they're beginning to cooperate together more than they have since 1964. That's not the same as saying they are the same. And I think they're right. I think Putin and Xi Jinping both see mutually beneficial opportunities in the vacuum that the world assessment describes as being left by President Trump. So I didn't read it the way you read it. They just said that they are working more together now. They're not talking about recreating the Sino-Soviet threat.
The national security strategy, national defense strategy, they're put together.
National security strategy and national defense strategy are these high-level, lovely documents about this is where I'm trying to go, and it doesn't move a dime, move a ship, or do anything else. The worldwide threat assessment is the DNI and his associates' view of the threats that we face, and they're very different documents. And if I was thinking about what the IC is doing, I would never read the NIS. I would read the worldwide threat assessment. That's one you want to read. We have a lot of. But no, Trump. He shows no capacity for change at all. The idea of expecting a 72-year-old man to suddenly find nirvana and truth and have an epiphany and change who he is, I think is farcical.
But what's the intelligence community's response? What can they do?
Keep your head down.
I mean,
keep your head down and keep.
Do
your work. You do your work. You do your best work. And if you can't get to the president, you do your work for the people around him. I think.
Well, just to start on that, yeah, we have to remember the intelligence community is serving the whole policymaking community, and the president gets disproportionate emphasis, but the great majority of the work is not done just for the president.
Especially
but
the president.
I am just as pessimistic as Mark is about whether this relationship is sunk forever, although I would note that you can't rule out some event, something where the community or a particular agency shines in the eye of the guy at the top. I mean, I remember, under Johnson, reportedly, when Richard Helms was director, he was initially excluded from the Johnson inner decision-making circle. They were making all the decisions about the Vietnam War, and other things. And then along came the 1967 Middle East War, in which the agency's advanced assessment that the war would break out and the Israelis would win it in a matter of days looked fantastic in retrospect. And this reportedly was part of what won Helms a seat at LBJ's Tuesday lunch policy table, from which he had previously been excluded. I don't expect that's going to happen with Trump. Trump is not LBJ, but you can't
rule out this sort of thing. On Doyle McManus's question, I'm glad you raised that, because we do have to distinguish between the individual chief and the agency, and it really was a Pompeo-Trump relationship and a Pompeo-White House relationship, not an agency one. And so when Pompeo went to state, I think he has continued to fill, in Trump's eyes, basically the same role he was filling before. And of course, when he was DCI, he was already running with the North Korean thing. And so Gina Haspel's role, far, far different. Far less public, of course. And I think she understands that and realizes that and is going to try to stick to her knitting, but there wasn't some kind of institutional relationship developed there. And O'Day, as far as Iraq is concerned, I'm not so worried about intelligence. I mean, I don't think he spilled things that would be a problem there. I'm more worried about U.S.-Iraqi relations and the temperature of relations with Iran.
A couple of brief points. I agree the relationship is on life support. I'm not very optimistic for the chances that it can be repaired effectively under this president. Not impossible. I agree with Paul. You know, there's some wild cards that could occur that could change the dynamics, but I wouldn't put any great faith in that happening. A brief comment on policy support in the intelligence community and the way this factors into people's personnel files and performance evaluations. Policy support is an important function of the intelligence community, and people should be evaluated in that as one of their many responsibilities. You get into trouble, however, when it has a disproportionate impact on personnel evaluations and promotion recommendations. I'll tell you one thing that doesn't have enough emphasis in those decisions, and that is your track record of accuracy in actually getting your analysis right. I would like to see more emphasis on that, because that could have a significant impact on what is incentivized, the kinds of behaviors that intelligence officers engage in, and it sends a message about what's encouraged. Analysts are very smart people. They analyze things for a living. They very quickly figure out what it is that gets them ahead in their careers. And if it's putting things in the PDB that get read with interest marks, that's what they will focus on doing. And that, getting access and being relevant to policy is important, but like anything in life, there has to be a balance. And if that is emphasized disproportionately, you have some problems.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and thank you to our panelists.
Good, you guys